The bright studio lights cast a polished glow over the sleek modern set of The Rachel Morris Show, a primetime talk show known for its sharp political commentary and relentless questioning. Tonight, the audience could feel an underlying tension in the air, as the usual mix of lighthearted banter and serious political discussion was about to shift into something more intense. The stage was set not just for a conversation, but for a confrontation. The guest of honor was Barron Trump, the 18-year-old son of former President Donald Trump. His presence on a major talk show was a rare occurrence. Barron had largely stayed out of the political spotlight, preferring a quieter life away from the media frenzy that surrounded his family. Yet, recently, he had begun to make public appearances, showcasing an intelligence and quiet confidence that took many by surprise. Rachel Morris, the seasoned liberal host, was known for her sharp tongue and biting commentary, especially when it came to conservative figures. She had made her career on mocking right-wing personalities and politicians, often framing them as out of touch or unqualified for the positions they held. In Barron's case, she had prepared an interview that would initially appear lighthearted, but under the surface, it was laced with condescension and loaded questions meant to provoke. Her goal was simple: to make Barron seem like an inexperienced young man, someone who didn't belong in the political conversation. The audience's anticipation was palpable. Rachel's reputation for grilling guests, especially those she disagreed with politically, meant that everyone was eager to see how Barron would fare under the spotlight. Would he falter under the pressure, as many expected, or would he rise to the challenge in ways no one saw coming? As the camera rolled, Rachel welcomed Barron with a practiced smile, her eyes gleaming with an almost mischievous energy. "Well, well, well, we have a Trump on my show. I didn't think that would ever happen," she said, her voice dripping with irony. The audience chuckled, their attention immediately focused on the young man who had walked onto the stage with quiet composure, towering at 6'7" and carrying himself with a calm, assured demeanor that contrasted sharply with Rachel's eager energy. Barron's face was relaxed, his posture confident as he crossed one leg over the other and adjusted his suit. Despite the noise from the audience, he seemed unaffected by the attention. His gaze focused and unfazed as Rachel continued her remarks. The stage was set for something much more than just another celebrity interview. It was about to become a battle of wits, with Rachel expecting the usual unease from a young guest, but finding herself faced with someone who was already proving to be anything but ordinary. The tension in the room grew, as both the audience and Rachel herself realized that Barron Trump, though young, was not as easily intimidated as she had hoped. As the interview progressed, Rachel Morris, ever the seasoned liberal host, wasted no time in setting the tone with her signature approach: mockery. The audience's laughter echoed through the studio as she leaned forward with a mischievous glint in her eye, keen on making Barron Trump feel uncomfortable from the very beginning. "Well, well, well, we have a Trump on my show," she began, her words dripping with irony. "I didn't think that would ever happen." The audience responded with a mix of chuckles and curious glances, unsure whether to laugh at the awkwardness of the moment or to simply watch what Barron would do next. The young Trump, at 6'7", and with a calm composure that contrasted sharply with Rachel's eager energy, responded with a polite smile, completely unfazed by her remark. It was clear to everyone in the studio that Rachel's usual tactic of catching a guest off guard with humor wasn't going to rattle Barron. Undeterred, Rachel pushed forward, her tone still light but now laced with a layer of condescension. She leaned back in her chair, clasping her hands as she eyed him playfully. "Barron, this is your first big sit-down interview, isn't it?" she asked, her voice dripping with a false sense of warmth. She smirked as the audience let out a soft laugh, as if she had just caught him in a moment of vulnerability. But Barron, composed as ever, nodded slightly and responded calmly, "Yes, it is." Rachel, sensing an opportunity to dig deeper, continued with the same mocking tone. "Nervous?" she asked, her voice sweet but with an underlying edge. The audience laughed again, expecting Barron to stammer or react uncomfortably, but instead he simply shook his head, his composure unwavering. "Not at all," he responded, meeting her gaze directly. This response took Rachel off guard, and for a brief moment her usual smile froze, the realization settling in that Barron wasn't reacting the way she had expected. Undeterred, Rachel flipped through her notes, trying to find the next line of questioning that might break his calm exterior. She leaned in again, ready to drop her next jab. "Well, Barron, I have to say, people are fascinated by you," she said, almost theatrically, shaking her head as if amused. "I mean, come on, you're 18, ridiculously tall, and you come from that family. It's like you were made in a political laboratory." The audience laughed at the joke, and Rachel waited for Barron to squirm or blush, but again, he remained completely unfazed. Barron simply nodded politely, offering, "I suppose that's one way to look at it." His calm and unbothered response threw Rachel off balance for a second time. She had expected him to be thrown by the remark, maybe to show some sign of discomfort or vulnerability, but instead Barron was effortlessly handling her mockery with grace. Her grin tightened slightly as she tried to regain her footing. She had planned this interview to be an easy win, expecting Barron to be inexperienced and vulnerable to ridicule. But she quickly realized that the young man sitting across from her wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. With the audience's attention now fully on the exchange, the power dynamic of the interview began to shift. Rachel's initial mockery, meant to be lighthearted but sharp, had failed to make its mark. Barron Trump, despite his youth and his famous last name, was proving to be more composed and quick-witted than she had anticipated. Rachel's smugness began to waver, and though she tried to keep control of the interview, it was becoming clear to everyone that Barron was more than capable of handling himself in this arena. As the interview continued, Rachel Morris, growing increasingly frustrated, decided it was time to corner Barron Trump with a more direct approach. Having failed to break him with light-hearted mockery, she shifted gears, aiming to put him in an uncomfortable position with a more pointed question. Her eyes gleamed with a mix of confidence and calculation as she leaned in slightly, ready to dig deeper. "So, Barron," she began, her tone laced with a hint of challenge. "Growing up in Trump Tower, going to private schools, enjoying luxury vacations, did you ever feel like you were in a bit of a bubble? Like you weren't really seeing what real life is like for most people?" The audience murmured in anticipation, sensing the trap. It was a classic move. If Barron said no, he'd be painted as entitled and out of touch. But if he admitted to living in a bubble, he'd be acknowledging that his privileged upbringing separated him from the struggles of everyday Americans. Rachel leaned back, a smug smile playing on her lips as she waited for him to respond, certain that she had placed him in a no-win situation. But once again, Barron surprised her. Without missing a beat, he met her gaze and calmly replied, "Everyone grows up in a bubble, Ms. Morris. I think your childhood, for example, was probably very different from mine. Does that mean you're out of touch with how I grew up?" The room fell silent for a moment. Rachel blinked, caught off guard by his response. Instead of flinching, Barron had deftly turned the question back on her, forcing her to confront the assumption that people's lives could be judged so simplistically. His calm tone, combined with the astuteness of his reply, made it clear that he wasn't intimidated. Rachel, momentarily stunned, tried to recover. "Well, I wasn't exactly flying in private jets as a kid," she muttered, attempting to regain the narrative. Barron nodded slightly. "And I wasn't hosting late-night talk shows every night. Every life is unique. I don't think anyone fully understands someone else's reality unless they've lived it." The response was measured, yet it hit hard. The audience, now fully engaged, clapped unexpectedly, sensing the shift in the dynamic of the interview. Rachel, her smile now a bit more forced, cleared her throat and quickly changed tack. The question had backfired, and the control she'd once held over the conversation was slipping away. Her usual strategy of mocking and poking fun had failed to rattle Barron, and she was starting to realize that he was handling himself far better than she had anticipated. This was no ordinary young man. This was someone who had clearly prepared himself for the spotlight and wasn't willing to play by the usual rules of celebrity interviews. As she moved on to the next question, the audience was still buzzing with the quiet victory of Barron's effortless deflection. Rachel, now visibly flustered, tried to bring the conversation back to her familiar territory. She had expected Barron to fall into her trap, to stumble or retreat into defensiveness. But instead, he had turned the tables on her. The balance of power had shifted in that moment, and despite her best efforts, Rachel could no longer claim control over the interview. The moment the conversation shifted was almost imperceptible at first, but it was undeniable. Rachel Morris had expected Barron Trump to falter, to get flustered, perhaps even to reveal some hint of vulnerability that she could exploit. Yet, as the interview progressed, Barron continued to defy her expectations with a calm and poised demeanor. As she leaned forward once again, ready to launch into another attack, the power dynamics in the room subtly but decisively began to change. She attempted a sharper approach, one that she thought would get under his skin. "All right, Barron," she began, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Your father, Donald Trump, was one of the most controversial presidents in history. His policies, his tweets, the way he spoke about people, he wasn't exactly known for his subtlety, was he?" The audience seemed to perk up, sensing that Rachel was about to hit a nerve. This, she thought, would be the moment that Barron would crumble. His nerves would finally show and the audience would see him as nothing more than a product of his father's shadow. But Barron's response was so calm, it left Rachel grasping for the control she thought she still had. He simply raised an eyebrow and met her gaze. "Are we judging presidents by the things they say or by the things they do?" His words were measured, but they cut straight to the heart of Rachel's intended narrative. The question hung in the air, and the laughter in the studio died down almost instantly. The audience, which had expected Barron to squirm under the pressure, now seemed to be listening more intently than ever. Rachel's smug expression froze for a moment, her mind scrambling to recover from the unexpected turn. She had assumed that by bringing up his father's more controversial moments, she could force Barron to either defend him or distance himself, either of which could lead to an opening for further criticism. But Barron had turned the question back on her, challenging the premise itself. "Well, words matter, don't they?" Rachel managed to say, though the edge in her voice was beginning to waver. She was no longer in control of the narrative, and she knew it. "Sure," Barron replied, his tone still steady. "But actions matter more. If we judged every leader in history only by the worst things they said, we'd have to erase a lot of people from history books." The audience seemed to stir with approval, and the silence in the room grew heavier. The shift was palpable. Rachel had expected to control the conversation with her sharp wit, but instead Barron was controlling the pace, redirecting the dialogue with a quiet, confident wisdom. Rachel, clearly caught off guard, forced a laugh, trying to brush off the moment and regain her footing. All right, she said, trying to sound playful, though the tension was evident in her voice. "I see what you're doing here." But it was clear to everyone in the studio that the balance of power had shifted. Barron had not only held his own, but he had completely flipped the script. The more Rachel tried to push, the more Barron responded with a quiet but unshakable authority. Her attempts to provoke him only served to reveal her own discomfort, and the audience began to rally behind Barron, impressed by his composure and insight. She tried to regain control, but the air in the studio had already changed. Barron's confidence and quick thinking had left her struggling to keep up, and for the first time in the interview, Rachel was forced to acknowledge that the young man she had expected to mock and belittle had become the one in charge of the conversation. As Barron Trump continued to hold his own with an unshakable calm, Rachel Morris found herself struggling to regain control of the interview. The subtle shift in power that had occurred when Barron turned her question about his father's controversial comments back on her left Rachel visibly flustered. She had expected to provoke Barron, to make him squirm under the weight of his family name, but instead he had turned every question back on her with quiet confidence, and the studio audience was beginning to notice. Rachel, ever the professional, quickly tried to adjust, her mind racing for the next move. She was no stranger to tough interviews, but this one was different. Instead of an easy target, she found herself facing an 18-year-old who was clearly more than prepared for the spotlight. Despite her best efforts to maintain the upper hand, Rachel could feel the tension building as Barron's calm composure seemed to deflate her usual bravado. She flashed a tight smile, trying to brush off the moment, but the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Barron had taken the conversation to places she hadn't anticipated, and the more she tried to steer it back to familiar territory, the more she realized she was losing control. Determined not to let the audience see her struggle, Rachel decided to push further, but her attempts were becoming increasingly desperate. She leaned in, trying once more to provoke a reaction from Barron. All right, she began, her voice a bit more strained than before. You've handled yourself well so far, but let's be honest. Your father was one of the most controversial presidents in history. His policies, his words, the way he handled himself, do you ever wish he had acted differently or that he had toned it down a bit? She expected Barron to get defensive, or perhaps to hesitate, offering an opportunity for her to highlight some flaw in his family dynamic. Instead, Barron simply shrugged and offered a measured response. Well, I think my father's actions were far more important than his words. He took bold steps that many others wouldn't have. People focus so much on what he said, but they often overlooked what he did. His response was simple, but it was a clear challenge to Rachel's attempt to paint his father as a figure of divisiveness. Instead of answering her question on his terms, Barron flipped the conversation to focus on the substance of his father's leadership, something that Rachel clearly hadn't expected. The studio, which had been buzzing with laughter and anticipation, now sat in a heavier silence as Barron's words lingered in the air. Rachel, now visibly struggling, tried to pivot again, hoping to regain the upper hand, but her tone, once confident and cutting, was starting to waver. Okay, she said, attempting to maintain some semblance of control. I see what you're doing here, Barron, but let's be real. You've lived a life of privilege. Trump Tower, private schools, luxury vacations. You've had it easy compared to most Americans. So how can you possibly understand the struggles of everyday people? The question was sharp, meant to put Barron on the defensive and make him seem out of touch with the working class. Rachel leaned forward, watching for any sign of discomfort, any crack in his composure. Barron, however, did not flinch. His response was calm but direct. I understand that everyone has their own story. My family's story is unique, but that doesn't mean I can't understand what others go through. It's about perspective, not about being born into privilege. I've always believed that what matters is how we treat others and what we do with the opportunities we've been given. His response was calculated, thoughtful, and once again it defied Rachel's attempts to corner him. The audience, who had initially been skeptical of Barron's ability to handle the pressure, now seemed to be on his side, reacting with quiet approval. Rachel, realizing she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted, shifted in her seat uncomfortably. She tried to force a laugh, as if to downplay her failure to provoke Barron, but her composure was cracking. The more she pushed, the more she was reminded that Barron wasn't just another political figure she could easily mock or dismiss. He was someone who had clearly spent time preparing for moments like this, and he wasn't going to back down under pressure. Her smile was forced now, her previous sense of control slipping further away. As the interview progressed, Rachel found herself not just struggling to regain control of the conversation, but also questioning her own approach. Barron was not the inexperienced young man she had expected to mock. Instead, he was proving to be a skilled communicator, confident and well-prepared. Despite her attempts to steer the interview back to a place where she could regain the upper hand, Rachel knew that the dynamic had shifted. For the first time, she realized that she was no longer the one in charge of the conversation. Barron Trump had effortlessly turned the interview into a discussion on his terms, and Rachel, despite her best efforts, was losing the battle for control. The audience could see it too, and the shift was palpable. Instead of seeing Barron as an easy target, they were beginning to view him as someone who was not only capable of holding his own, but also someone who could outmaneuver a seasoned talk show host. Rachel had underestimated him, and as the interview drew to a close, it was clear that Barron Trump had not only survived, but had completely outclassed her. As the interview progressed, Barron Trump continued to demonstrate an incredible level of composure that Rachel Morris was not prepared for. Her usual tactics, designed to make her guests uncomfortable and force them into an awkward position, were failing miserably. Barron had remained unflinching in the face of her sharp jabs and pointed questions, but when Rachel pivoted to her next line of questioning, hoping to expose what she thought was an inherent flaw in Barron's upbringing and his political ambitions, Barron responded with a quiet but undeniable confidence that left her scrambling for a response. After a series of attempts to criticize Barron's background, his family, and his privileged upbringing, Rachel, growing increasingly frustrated, decided to move on to what she hoped would be her breakthrough question. "All right, Barron," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Let's be honest here. You've lived a life of unimaginable privilege. Trump Tower, private schools, luxury vacations. How can you possibly understand the struggles of the average American? How can you relate to them when you've been insulated by wealth and power your entire life?" The question, meant to expose Barron as out of touch with everyday Americans, seemed to be one that would force him to either defend his wealth or admit that his life was fundamentally different from that of the people he now hoped to represent. The audience waited with bated breath, anticipating how the young Trump would respond, eager to see if he would crack under the pressure or make a slip that could be used against him. What Rachel didn't expect, however, was Barron's calm, collected response that completely disarmed her. Barron leaned back in his chair slightly, maintaining a steady posture, and his response was direct and assured. "I understand that everyone's life is different," he said, his voice measured and unwavering. "My family's story is certainly unique, but that doesn't mean I can't understand or empathize with the struggles of others. I've always believed that what matters is not where you start in life, but what you do with the opportunities you have." The audience was taken aback by his poised reply. Instead of getting defensive or retreating into a canned political answer, Barron spoke with a maturity beyond his years, acknowledging his privilege without shying away from the truth. But he didn't stop there. He continued, making an even more profound statement. "It's about perspective, not about the lifestyle you've been born into," he explained. "If you only ever surround yourself with people who are exactly like you, then yes, it might be harder to understand others. But if you keep an open mind and truly listen to what people are saying, you'll find that their struggles and their hopes are not as different from yours as you might think." His words, delivered with an air of confidence and sincerity, seemed to shift the entire dynamic of the conversation. The sharp edges of Rachel's questioning, meant to create a divide between Barron and the rest of the country, had been softened by his words, and for the first time, Rachel found herself unable to twist the conversation in the way she had intended. Barron was not only owning his privilege but was turning the question around, highlighting the importance of perspective and empathy rather than using his background as an excuse. Rachel, visibly taken aback by the response, tried to recover. She had been prepared for him to stumble or deflect, but Barron's words hit at the heart of what she was trying to undermine. She attempted to regain control, but her usual quick-witted remarks seemed to falter in the face of Barron's calm wisdom. The audience, sensing the shift, began to react more favorably to Barron, some even applauding quietly as his composed answers continued to challenge Rachel's attempts to rile him up. Barron's ability to speak so confidently, without hesitation or defensiveness, left Rachel scrambling. Her scripted questions, designed to put him on the spot and expose a flaw, were now being met with thoughtful, well-reasoned responses that defied her narrative. She had hoped that by focusing on Barron's background, she could paint him as out of touch with the common American experience. But instead, he had used her questions to highlight the importance of empathy and understanding, regardless of background or status. Barron's quiet confidence, paired with his ability to think critically in the moment, had turned the interview on its head. Rachel's sharp commentary and pointed questions were losing their power, and for the first time, she found herself struggling to steer the conversation in the direction she had planned. The more she tried, the more it became clear that Barron Trump wasn't just the youngest member of the famous Trump family. He was a young man who was capable of holding his own in a public debate, outmaneuvering seasoned professionals with ease. The studio, which had once been filled with nervous anticipation, now buzzed with approval for Barron. His calm, confident demeanor and articulate responses had shifted the power dynamic, leaving Rachel Morris in the uncomfortable position of trying to reclaim control of an interview that was rapidly slipping through her fingers. As Barron Trump continued to handle each question with remarkable composure, Rachel Morris found herself increasingly uncomfortable. Her usual confidence and sharp wit were no match for Barron's calm, well-thought-out responses. It was clear to everyone in the studio that the young man sitting across from her was not the inexperienced, vulnerable guest she had anticipated. but someone who was fully prepared for the intense scrutiny of her questioning. Barron had not only deflected her attempts at mockery, but had turned each question back on her with a quiet strength that left Rachel floundering. Her attempts to provoke him had fallen flat, and she was beginning to realize that her control over the interview was slipping away. Her discomfort grew more palpable as Barron's words began to resonate with the audience, who were responding more favorably to him with every passing moment. Rachel's usual ability to command the room and steer the conversation was no longer working. Barron's responses were not just defensive, they were insightful, challenging Rachel's assumptions in a way that made her questions feel hollow. Every time she tried to regain the upper hand, Barron calmly redirected the conversation with wisdom beyond his years, and each time the audience seemed to gravitate more toward him. The laughter and jeers she had expected from the audience when mocking Barron slowly died down, replaced by an unexpected respect for his composure and intelligence. As Rachel's discomfort mounted, the audience could sense that the interview had taken a turn. They had come to see an easy target, an 18-year-old who might stumble or falter under the pressure of a seasoned talk show host. Instead, they were witnessing someone who not only withstood the pressure but seemed to thrive under it. Barron's ability to remain unflustered in the face of pointed questions made Rachel's usual tactics of intimidation feel ineffective, and she struggled to find a way to assert herself once again. She tried to force a laugh, to inject humor into the conversation, but the audience wasn't buying it anymore. The nervous chuckles she had heard earlier were now replaced with a more supportive, even approving, response to Barron's calm and collected demeanor. Rachel, her posture stiffening, quickly flipped through her notes, desperately searching for a way to regain the upper hand. She could feel the eyes of the audience on her, their reactions increasingly supportive of Barron, and it only added to her growing discomfort. She had made a career out of controlling the narrative, of making her guests squirm under the spotlight. But now the tables had turned, the power dynamic in the room had shifted, and Rachel was no longer the one leading the conversation. She tried to salvage the situation by asking about Barron's future plans, attempting to steer the conversation back to safer territory, but her attempts were met with Barron's poised responses, which only reinforced the perception that he was in complete control of the interview. "So, Barron," Rachel asked, her voice less confident now, "do you want to go into politics, or are you just riding on your father's legacy?" It was a loaded question, meant to paint Barron as someone who couldn't forge his own path. But Barron, as always, was ready with a response. He looked her square in the eye and replied, "People assume I'm just here because of my last name. The funny thing is, no one really knows what I stand for yet. People love to make assumptions about me before I even open my mouth. I think that's the real story." The audience erupted in applause, and for a moment Rachel froze. She had been expecting Barron to stammer, to falter under pressure, but instead he had once again turned the conversation in his favor. The applause from the audience only added to Rachel's discomfort. It was clear now that the young Trump wasn't just holding his own, he was dominating the interview, and the audience was fully behind him. Rachel's expression tightened, and she shifted in her seat, visibly rattled. She had expected this interview to be a quick and easy win, a chance to undermine Barron and expose him as out of touch with reality. Instead, she was the one on the defensive, and the audience could sense it. Her usual strategies of using humor and sarcasm to control the narrative had backfired, and Barron's calm, measured responses had exposed her attempts at mockery for what they were, shallow and ineffective. As the interview neared its conclusion, Rachel tried to smile, but it was strained, forced. The easy flow of the conversation had turned into a battle of wits, and Barron had emerged victorious. The audience was no longer laughing at Barron, they were laughing with him. Rachel's discomfort was palpable, but there was little she could do to reclaim the control she had lost. The interview that had started with her in the driver's seat had now become a showcase of Barron Trump's poise, intelligence, and unexpected ability to outmaneuver a seasoned host. The tables had well and truly turned, and Rachel had to face the reality that, despite her best efforts, Barron had won the conversation. The show would go down in history as one where a young, calm Trump had outclassed one of the sharpest political interviewers on television. And the audience, along with millions of viewers at home, would remember it as the moment Barron Trump stepped out of his father's shadow and into his own spotlight. The aftermath of the interview between Barron Trump and Rachel Morris was nothing short of explosive. Within hours of the interview airing, the clip went viral, with social media users across the country sharing their reactions to the unexpected turn of events. The internet was abuzz, and the headlines were filled with phrases like, "Barron Trump outsmarts Rachel Morris," and "The young Trump dominates talk show host." People couldn't stop talking about how the 18-year-old son of former President Donald Trump had outmaneuvered a seasoned political interviewer, leaving the liberal host flustered and visibly rattled. The shockwaves were felt across various platforms, with Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube flooded with clips, memes, and discussions centered around the interview. Thousands of users chimed in with their thoughts, many expressing astonishment at Barron's calm and composed demeanor. The reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of Barron, with many commenting on his maturity and how he handled himself with such confidence despite the pressure and the obvious attempts at mockery. The term "Barron O's" began trending as viewers started to rally behind him, praising his intelligence and ability to turn the tables on a talk show host who was well known for her aggressive interviewing style. "Barron is not to be underestimated," one tweet read. "He held his own against Rachel Morris like a seasoned pro. I'm genuinely impressed." People marveled at how Barron had handled each question, not only deflecting the jabs but using them as opportunities to showcase his poise and depth of thought. His responses were measured and insightful, often turning Rachel's own questions around on her, exposing the biases and assumptions behind them. This wasn't just an interview. It had become a masterclass in handling political attacks with dignity and confidence. The more people watched the interview, the more they were taken aback by how Barron had turned the narrative from an ambush into a victory. The media outlets quickly picked up on the story, analyzing every moment of the exchange. Commentary on various news sites highlighted how Barron had managed to control the conversation without raising his voice or resorting to tactics of aggression. Many journalists admitted they had underestimated the young Trump, and the realization was almost universal. Barron was far more than just another privileged heir. He had the presence of mind to handle political questions and media criticism with a level of maturity that surpassed what many expected from someone so young. On platforms like YouTube, clips of the interview racked up millions of views, with users replaying Barron's calm retorts and his ability to silence Rachel with nothing more than a simple, well-timed question. "Barron just completely flipped the script," one YouTube comment read. "Rachel thought she could control the conversation, but Barron took it back. He's clearly been raised well and is not the average celebrity kid. I'm a fan now." In some circles, the interview became more than just a conversation between two people. It symbolized a challenge to the narrative the media often creates about public figures, especially those from wealthy or powerful backgrounds. Barron, despite his last name, had shown that he wasn't just a product of his family's fame. He was his own person, capable of standing firm in his beliefs and handling difficult situations with composure and grace. On news shows and podcasts, pundits debated whether Barron's performance signaled the start of a new era for the Trump family. Would this interview mark the beginning of Barron stepping into the spotlight more frequently? Many agreed that the young Trump had not only survived the media's attempt to paint him as a figurehead, but he had flourished. It wasn't just his ability to speak with confidence that impressed people. It was the depth of his responses, his ability to think critically in the moment, and his ability to turn a potentially hostile environment into a showcase of his poise and intelligence. Despite the widespread support from the public, there were still some detractors who questioned Barron's motivations and whether he was simply trying to ride on his family's coattails. These critics, however, were often drowned out by the overwhelming applause for Barron's performance. His supporters saw him as a breath of fresh air, a young man who refused to be silenced or reduced to his family's political legacy. Barron Trump had managed to do what few others in his position could have. He held his ground, stood firm in his beliefs, and turned an awkward situation into a moment of triumph. For Rachel Morris, the fallout was swift and unavoidable. The clip of Barron's responses was replayed across social media, and her discomfort was palpable. The tight control she once had over her show was slipping, as she found herself the subject of mockery and analysis. Social media users began pointing out the cracks in her performance, with some suggesting that her attempts to belittle Barron had only exposed her own bias and arrogance. Rachel thought she could control Barron, one viral meme read, but she was outclassed by an 18-year-old. The backlash was severe enough that Rachel was forced to respond publicly. In a statement issued the following day, she acknowledged that the interview had not gone as planned, but she remained defiant in her stance. "The interview was meant to be challenging," she said, "but I respect the fact that Barron handled himself with poise. It's never easy being on the other side of an intense interview, and I appreciate his composure." While Rachel's public acknowledgement of Barron's performance was viewed by some as a gracious admission of defeat, others saw it as a way for her to save face in the wake of the overwhelming online support for Barron. The conclusion of the interview marked a turning point in Barron Trump's public life. The media, which had initially viewed him as just another member of the Trump family, now began to see him as an individual, capable of standing up for himself and engaging with tough questions without faltering. Barron's performance had effectively solidified his presence as a rising figure, one who might not just be the son of a former president, but someone with the potential to carve out his own path in the public eye. The internet reaction was loud, clear, and unanimous. Barron Trump had proven that he was not just a product of his name, he was a force to be reckoned with in his own right. One of the most profound lessons from this story is the importance of resilience, self-confidence, and the ability to stand firm in one's beliefs, especially when faced with adversity or criticism. Barron Trump, despite his young age and the pressure of being constantly scrutinized, handled a challenging interview with grace and composure. This is a reminder to all of us, particularly older generations who have lived through various life challenges, that the ability to stay calm, confident, and unshaken in the face of difficult situations is an invaluable skill. Throughout life, we encounter many moments of judgment, or even mockery, but how we choose to respond is what truly defines us. Rather than reacting impulsively or defensively, Barron demonstrated that thoughtful, composed responses can disarm even the sharpest criticisms. This is a lesson that is particularly relevant as we grow older. With life experience, we learn that maintaining our integrity and sticking to our values is key to navigating life's challenges. It is a powerful reminder that personal growth and resilience are not about never facing obstacles, but about how we face them, how we respond when life pushes us to our limits, and how we remain true to our principles despite external pressures. Additionally, the story highlights the significance of self-reflection and the willingness to learn from experiences. Barron's ability to openly address the question of privilege without becoming defensive or embarrassed shows a maturity that many people acquire over time. As older adults, we have had the opportunity to reflect on our lives, make mistakes, and learn from them. Barron's humility in accepting his background, while not letting it define or limit him, encourages us to acknowledge our own experiences and use them as tools for growth rather than excuses for limitations. It is a reminder that no matter our age, we can continue to evolve and grow. Finally, the story underlines the value of empathy and understanding. Barron's ability to connect with the audience by speaking about perspective and the importance of listening was a powerful moment. It is easy, especially in today's polarized world, to focus on differences and view others through a lens of judgment. However, Barron's calm and reasoned approach teaches us the importance of empathy and understanding the experiences of others without rushing to conclusions. For seniors, this is an essential lesson. In a time when generational gaps can sometimes feel wide, taking the time to listen to and understand the experiences of others, particularly younger generations, fosters meaningful connections and mutual respect. Ultimately, this story serves as a reminder that no matter our age or background, we all have the capacity to learn, grow, and contribute to a world that values wisdom, understanding, and resilience.